I guess I'll start with a word about the title and where it comes from. The lecture derives from a project that I have sort of referred to as an alternative history of the American West. An alternative history that, and this gets to the title of the lecture, that may remind some of you of a venture not into the Western past, but into a parallel universe. Now, those of you of a certain age, not too many of you, will remember the Rod Serling television program, and how at the beginning of each episode, Rod Serling would come out and intone in the sort of most sober manner, "You are about to enter another dimension, a dimension not only of sight and sound, but of mind. You're about to cross over into," this is where the theme music is supposed to come up, "you're about to cross over into the Twilight Zone." Now, that sense of entering into another reality, I hope, is what the image that I chose for the poster that was sort of advertising this lecture, I hope that it conveyed that. This is a painting by Kim Wiggins, who's a contemporary Western artist. Is obviously not the ways in which Western artists have usually painted the meeting between, and Jay Buckley, I think, is here. Yes, okay. I don't think, Jay, that we have any extant images like this. Between the Corps of Discovery and the Mandans in the winter of 1804, 1805. I think it looks instead how Rod Serling would have imagined it if the Twilight Zone had been filmed in color rather than black and white, and if Vincent van Gogh was the cinematographer. Still, though my project may suggest to some a crossover into the Twilight Zone, I think the alternative history that I'm exploring is really not so far out. What I'm pursuing is a history of Concord across North American frontiers, borderlands, and wests. Now, to be sure, Concord is certainly not the first term that comes to mind when thinking about the mingling and meetings of peoples and cultures that have shaped and continues to shape the histories of the American West. To the contrary, not concord, but conquest or conflict have become the terms around which we more commonly construct our newer Western histories. That, as Patricia Limerick's 1987 book underscored, is the legacy bequeathed to us by the Western past. Concord may strike you, in fact, as quite alien to Western history, especially when considered in the context of the title that I've tentatively given to the book and the museum exhibition on which I'm working and of which this is a part. That book is called Can We All Just Get Along? An Alternative History of the American West. And as I say, those of you who remember your history, at least of Los Angeles history, know that Can We All Just Get Along was the phrase uttered by Rodney King during the Los Angeles riots in the spring of 1992. It was the beating of King, then the acquittal of the police officers of Rodney King, who set off what turned into the most costly eruption of urban unrest in the history of the United States. When Rodney King made that tearful plea, Los Angeles was in flames. So it would seem that when posed as a question, can we all get along, rather than a plea, the answer would seem to be an emphatic no. And no, it would seem, has been the answer not only in Los Angeles in the late 20th century, but across the broader West and across the centuries of Western history, where the shedding of blood has become synonymous with that history. Now, that said, there has been an alternative tradition to the conceptualization of Western history, one that has downplayed or sometimes maybe deliberately erased the violence from the past. That's the vision of John Gast's American Progress, in which Indians and bison slide sort of peacefully off the canvas and out of history, out of view. In their place marches a peaceful parade of pioneer types moving across the canvas and across the continent, with our angelic female Columbia figure floating above, bringing civilization with the string of the telegraph wire in one hand and a school book in the other. This was also the vision that inspired Frederick Jackson Turner's sense of the significance of the frontier. Turner's understanding of the frontier process was built on quiet successions. It was not really a history of cross-cultural understandings or peaceful coexistence, but like John Gast's American Progress, Frederick Jackson Turner's vision of Western history downplayed violence. Now, against that sort of Pacific tradition of writing Western history or seeing Western history, John Gast or Frederick Jackson Turner, I think we have numerous competing storytellers, reenactors, and historians. While Turner's vision, John Gast's vision, gained ascendancy among historians, it was Buffalo Bill's much wilder Western history that won over the masses. And it was Theodore Roosevelt's sort of big stick history that celebrated the wars that won the West. The shedding of blood was not, T.R. once wrote, the shedding of blood was not always agreeable, but it was, quote, the healthy sign of the virile strength of the American people. Here, Roosevelt chose not to speak softly, exulting in our, quote, manifest destiny to swallow up the lands of all adjoining nations who were too weak to withstand us. This was not something for which Teddy Roosevelt apologized. Quite the contrary. Roosevelt deemed it desirable for the good of humanity at large that the American people should ultimately crowd out the Mexicans from their sparsely populated northern provinces and wrest the rest of the West from Indians as well. I suppose what's changed most dramatically in recent decades is the meaning that we ascribe to conquest, to conflict, to bloodshed, to violence. Not that long ago, even a blood-soaked history served triumphant purposes. Warfare secured the manifest destiny of the United States. Violence regenerated the American spirit. Its redemptive power made the United States, made Americans into who they are, who they were, and made the United States into a world power. This was, by and large, a history, a mythology that was intended to make us feel good. More recently, historians of the American West have inverted perspectives. Now we likely lament what Patricia Limerick labeled the legacy of conquest. Now, I used to try to explain this inversion in the way in which we tell our Western histories. I used to try to explain it to my students by talking about the transition in cinematic Westerns from the John Wayne Western to the Dances with Wolves version of Western history. Until it occurred to me a few years ago, as I looked out on the puzzled faces of my students, that John Wayne has waned in the popular imagination, and Dances with Wolves, and this is where you really begin to feel old, and Dances with Wolves came out when they were in diapers, if that. But even those unfamiliar with these cultural touchstones get the change in perspectives and get the idea that the history of westward expansion, once a feel-good myth, has been recast in recent years as a feel-guilty myth. So when I tell people that I'm working on a museum exhibition, that I'm writing an alternative history of the American West that focuses on stories of intercultural concord, the usual first reaction I get is that I've moved into the Twilight Zone, Or if not that, then it's probably going to be a very, very short book that I'm planning on writing. Now, the fact is, though, I'm not alone in this attraction for an alternative history of peace, love, and understanding. That became clear to me also recently when I polled my students about what images of Indians, or even what individual Indians, are most iconic. Which are the Indian figures from history that first come to mind? Now, up until maybe 10 years ago or so, the students were quick to go to the familiar figure of the Plains Indian warrior, usually on horseback, in headdress, and then if I pressed them to name which Indians came to mind, they usually came back with Sitting Bull or Geronimo, Cochise. In recent years, though, the response has shifted. Instead of these images and individuals, the overwhelming winners have been, and here I should say the next slide that you see has had to be censored because I was told this afternoon that Disney's people would come after me if, or come after you if we put it up. I don't think they'd come after me, if the Red Center videotaped this lecture and then put it up on their website. So what you're supposed to see here is an image on the right of the U.S. postage stamp of Sacagawea, but on the left was supposed to be Disney's Pocahontas, because those are the two Indians that have sort of come forward in recent years and have, as I said, replaced, at least in my students' imagination and minds, who are the most famous, most celebrated, most iconic of American Indians. Now, the former, I guess, is no surprise. The students were, after all, raised on the Disney movie that you're not allowed to see here. The latter came to the fore, obviously, as a result of being front and center in the bicentennial commemorations of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Although separated by nearly 2 centuries in time and by place, by half a continent, Pocahontas and Sacagawea have much in common. Both have been assigned places in historical opening acts. Pocahontas plays that part in the first pages of English colonization in North America, which used to be seen as a starting point of westward expansion. Sacagawea's involvement in the Lewis and Clark expedition puts her in play at what is commonly seen as the opening of the American West. Both Pocahontas and Sacagawea were also quite young when they came on the historical stage. Both women, well, I guess both really girls, married European men. Both bore interracial offspring, and both won their lasting fame for their role in brokering intercultural peace, in creating moments of concord between Indians and Euro-Americans. This, after all, is in sharp contrast between those previously most iconic Indian figures who were older, who were male, who were made famous for their conflict, for their militant military resistance to U.S. expansion, to American or Euro-American expansionism. By contrast, Pocahontas and Sacagawea, as I say, owe their lasting fame to something quite opposite. I suppose one could say they also have in common how little we know about them. At least with Pocahontas, we have a portrait, and I guess I could have put the portrait up here because that isn't under the same Disney's watchful eyes. With Sacagawea, though, we don't know what she looked like. All of the artistic renderings that we have, whether by Kim Wiggins or the U.S. Postal Service or any of the sculptors who have created images of Pocahontas, are all of their own imagination. We don't know really where she was born, don't know when or where she died, don't even know what her name really was. That's a lot of don't knows for someone who has become the most celebrated of American Indians. None of which, of course, has stopped historians, biographers, novelists, playwrights, painters from rushing in, especially of late, to fill that void. This is another one by Kim Wiggins. You recognize his distinctive style. This is Lewis and Clark's encounter in Sacagawea's reunion with Kamehameha, on the journey with her long-lost brother. What fascinates me looking back now a few years later on the bicentennial of the Lewis and Clark expedition is just how much hoopla it generated. I mean, I know Richard White, the historian Richard White, is fond of quoting or fond of the saying that Americans don't care that much about history, but they sure love their anniversaries. But I don't actually think that's entirely true. I mean, I guess we love certain anniversaries a lot more than others, and it's never all that clear why certain anniversaries resonate with the American popular imagination in the way that others, arguably historically more significant, don't. That is to say, in this case, why is it that the Lewis and Clark expedition generated an outpouring of books and magazine articles and commercial paraphernalia, like these are from the Autry store, where you could buy famous Fort Mandan blue hoe cakes or Columbia River salmon jerky. And then, of course, there were plenty of cookbooks. If you bought the Lewis and Clark foodstuffs, you could buy the Lewis and Clark cookbooks to learn how to cook like Lewis and Clark. There were also all sorts of productions that were mounted, all sorts of, I was in the airport just today in the LAX, and I noticed that they still sell Lewis and Clark travel paraphernalia, which you can pick up still. All sorts of productions. At the Autry, we staged Lewis and Clark the musical, which unfortunately didn't make it to Broadway. In St. Louis, they did Lewis and Clark the opera. Again, I'm not sure that made it too much further than that. But actually, what surprised me in all of the sort of discussions about the Lewis and Clark and all of the commercial and plays that came out, that nobody did a new movie, which really meant you have to go back to the Far Horizons, which was made at the time of the sesquicentennial of the Lewis and Clark expedition, starring Fred McMurray as Meriwether Lewis, Charlton Heston as William Clark, and that most famous of American Indians, Donna Reed, as Sacagawea. Now, actually, there was actually talk, HBO, and I was brought in briefly on this. HBO had talked about doing a sort of multi-part mini-series on the Lewis and Clark expedition that was, I mean, that had, I guess Edward Norton was attached to it as Meriwether Lewis, and Brad Pitt as, imagine that, as William Clark, which opened up the possibility of seeing, this is the racy version, seeing Angelina Jolie in the starring role of Sacagawea. Not likely to happen. In any case, it's sort of, as I say, I'm still sort of trying to figure out what all of that meant. Why so much attention on Lewis and Clark? And as I said, in some ways it was summarized by what I call the FeelGood Lewis and Clark, which is I think, the story that we tended to tell during the bicentennial. And here, this plush toy is sort of my favorite representation of that with, so for animal lovers, you get Seaman, Lewis's dog, in the front, and then you get Clark and Sacagawea and York and Lewis, all sort of, the entire expedition sort of condensed into a happy sort of multicultural foursome, all happily paddling along, all happily getting along. And that, as I said, is the sort of feel-good version that we tended to tell. Now, myth-breaking historians, needless to say, and we have one of them in this room, Jay, are quick to point out that things didn't really happen that way. Neither Pocahontas, for that matter, nor Sacagawea lived happily ever after, as Disney's Imagineers might want it to have been. Their real lives bore little relation to those fairy tales. But then, it seems to be the recent imaginings of Pocahontas or Sacagawea, which have the virtue of making us feel good again about our expansionist past, aren't really meant to tell us that much about them. I think what they rather tell us more about is about us, about our yearning for an alternative foundation myth for American westward expansion, for a reconstituted frontier history that begins not on dark and bloody ground, but on a landscape of peace and love and understanding. Now, my quest then for an alternative history may seem to some an errand beyond the realm of history, crossing into that other dimension conjured up by Rod Serling. Our affection for kinder, gentler frontiers, as evidenced by our embrace of a particular retelling of the Lewis and Clark story, may come across as merely an exercise in wishful thinking, a quest for what I've sometimes derided as a search for kumbaya colonialism. That's not what I'm after, though. That's not what my search is about. I'm not looking to whitewash the Western past, to clean up its or cleanse it of its bloodiness and of its misdeeds. My alternative history of the American West is instead one of possibilities. Possibilities that were occasionally realized, though rarely stabilized, sometimes forgotten, and when remembered, often through a hazy lens that distorts as much as it distills. My purpose is to learn when and where such glints of opportunity developed, how it was in these instances that people overcame their differences as opposed to being overcome by those differences, why those moments occurred yet so rarely endured, and what finally is the legacy of Concord. This alternative history, I should be clear, builds on a vast and growing scholarly literature, even if many of the scholars who have contributed to it would not necessarily acknowledge their connection to it. This scholarship, though, has uncovered lots of examples in which people, against their prior histories, managed to get along with former adversaries, at least for a while. True, these episodes do not reach the fantasies given us by Pocahontas's animators or by Sacagawea's more unbridled commemorators. But they teach us that amidst a long record of blood-splattering, people-scattering, world-shattering conflict, there was also a smattering of concord. In this alternative history, meetings produced minglings, collisions yielded to collusions, cultural convergences promoted intercultural comity, always, though, with the caveat, for a while. For my alternative history, I have opted to select several episodes which I hope give some sense of the range of situations in which people got along, in which experiences of amity defied expectations of enmity. If Pocahontas and Sacagawea represent the new faces of an alternative Western past, I have chosen to seek my alternative history in a set of particular places at particular moments. Now, this history, again, I want to emphasize, is not designed to replace histories of dark and bloody grounds. These places, though, I hope, provide lessons in how common grounds were found and why they were lost. To be more specific, and I don't have time to go through this in detail, but to be more specific, I'm focusing on 6 different sites over a sort of 300, 400 year period. I first go to Mackinac Island, or to the Straits of Mackinac, at or near the confluence of several Great Lakes. Mackinac's heyday as an outpost of trading furs occurred during the 18th century, a period in which claim to it passed from France to Britain and then to the United States, though really most of its environs remained principally Indian countries. It also falls within the boundary of the territory that the historian Richard White retrospectively designated as the middle ground. Since its publication, Richard White's book of that title has inspired a scholarly rush to uncover the existence and explain the persistence of similar diplomatic arrangements and cultural fusions. Instead of the middle ground, new studies found or have claimed to find middle grounds across the early American landscape. Here, though, I return to the original middle ground as Richard White mapped it, to explore its formative place in the history of intercultural concord. My second site, Apple Creek, south of the Missouri River on the west bank of the Mississippi River, is far more obscure. Where various reconstructed historic sites and monuments affirm the history of the fur trade that sustained the middle ground around Mackinac, no such historical markers identify what transpired around Apple Creek in southeastern Missouri, just north of Cape Girardeau. Indeed, although I've studied the place for many years, finding the creek itself is no easy task. It has itself been erased from almost every map. Like Mackinac, though, Apple Creek also saw an overlap and a succession of colonial claimants during the second half of the 18th century. Here, French, Spanish, and Americans shared occupancy with diverse Indians, primarily Shawnee and Delaware Indians, who were themselves refugees to the area. Though sometimes in conflict with outsiders, neighboring settlements coexisted quite peaceably into the first decade of the 19th century. In a remarkable example of reconciliation, Shawnee and Delaware Indians and their American neighbors, people who had fought vicious wars against one another a decade earlier in the Ohio Valley, joined together. In part, they joined together to fight a common foe, in this case, the Osage Indians. But more than joining together to fight a common foe, they came together to hunt, to race horses, to trade, to gamble, to drink, to dance, even to mate, their mixed offspring further cementing a common culture that bound erstwhile adversaries to one another. Yet this history, like the creek itself, has been almost entirely buried. In fact, the only public indication of an Indian presence in this region is a plaque marking the route of the Cherokee's Trail of Tears through the region, through the area, which of course points to a history quite opposite to the alternative one about which I'm concerned. So next on my itinerary is the Lewis and Clark Trail, though I'm still undecided about what site to focus on. One could look at the Mandan, as Kim Wiggins' painting, or Sacagawea's reunion with Kamehameha, or any of a number of other possibilities. While the occurrences at these and other places along the Lewis and Clark Trail don't live up by any means to the more romanticized retellings of the story, they do afford us an opportunity to reconsider the expedition's general success in fulfilling Thomas Jefferson's instruction that in their intercourse with the natives, they should treat the Indian peoples in the most friendly and conciliatory manner which their own conduct will permit. Moving back partway across the continent, moving forward to the middle of the 19th century, my journey through this alternative past takes me next to the Overland Trail, to the Oregon Trail in particular, and in particular to Chimney Rock, one of the signal landmarks for travelers along those overland trails to Oregon and California. Again, there are lots of places along these trails that fit the bill, but Chimney Rock offers an especially good vantage point to continue the sort of pursuit of friendly and conciliatory relations. In this case, I follow recent scholarship in uncircling the wagons. It is, or that is, in shifting our vision away from the cinematic staple scene in which overland travelers circled the wagons against marauding Indians, to more mundane and generally more peaceful interchange between overland travelers and the Indians they encountered in the 1840s and 1850s. My fifth stop on this alternative history tour brings me into the 20th century and brings me closer to my current home. In particular, I look at the Boyle Heights neighborhood in East Los Angeles in the second quarter of the 20th century. Boyle Heights was then a remarkably diverse neighborhood. In fact, so diverse that the Federal Housing Authority, which was afraid of this diversity, in 1939 issues a report declaring the neighborhood, quote, hopelessly heterogeneous. And then basically saying we shouldn't make any loans to any people there because of its, quote, subversive and diverse mixed racial elements. Hopelessly heterogeneous. But what I'm fascinated by is the stories that Boyle Heights residents from that era tell of a remarkably diverse neighborhood, but in which people crossed ethnic lines to create a variety of social and then political networks. Now, I recognize here, as with the Lewis and Clark expedition, that we need to be a little bit careful about not romanticizing the memories of Boyle Heights in those bygone days. Still, while the neighborhood certainly saw struggles between groups, it's also nurtured a variety of interethnic associations, at first fleeting and fragile, but some more enduring, and certainly worth underscoring and understanding. My final destination is the Malpais borderlands region, a pyramid-shaped region in southwestern New Mexico and southeastern Arizona, whose base runs along, as the map here shows, whose base runs along the Mexican-U.S. border. Malpais, the name derives from the Spanish word for badlands, and for those accustomed to lusher landscapes, the designation seems all too well suited for what at first looks to be a bleak and barren terrain. Likely this corner of New Mexico and Arizona is best known for the bad times and bloody episodes that have punctuated its history. Just to the west of the Malpais are the sites of the Camp Grant massacre, the gunfight at the OK Corral, the Bisbee deportation. To its east is Lincoln County, where a war brought Billy the Kid into Western lore. In recent years, drug smugglers have favored the remote terrain as a path into the United States, and their conflicts have added to the region's bloody legacy. But it was the long-standing and often destructive conflicts between ranchers, government officials, and environmental groups that characterized the Malpais and so much of the American West that prompted the establishment of the Malpais Borderlands Group in the early 1990s. And over the last 2 decades, this organization has provided a model for conciliation and cooperation among ranchers, environmentalists, land managers, and scientists. Its defiance of what orthodox understanding suggested was possible made the Malpais Borderlands Group truly a maverick organization. And in so doing, I think has given us a model to look anew at the Western past, at the Western present, and to the Western future. Now, unlike Mackinac, Apple Creek, the Lewis and Clark Trail, the Overland Trail / Chimney Rock, Boyle Heights, the Malpais Borderlands Group presents us with an ongoing example of conciliation. By contrast, evidence that people came together and once got along at Mackinac, Apple Creek, Lewis and Clark Trail, Chimney Rock, Boyle Heights, lies buried in a deeper past. In those places, the alternative histories that I excavate came and went. Their instance of concord and conciliation faded and failed, yielding to bitter ethnic cleansings and often stormy racial conflicts. But before we relegate the history of these places to courts of reparation and reconciliation, it's important not to shortchange the existence, and in some cases, the persistence over several decades of alternative arrangements, of inclusive relations that defied for a time what we assumed to be the inexorable trend toward exclusive occupations or rigid hierarchies. That pushes us not to romanticize, but to understand the conditions that encouraged and sustained conciliation. In turn, it forces us to explain why these peaceful convergences unraveled and not simply assume that they should or that they must. Consider my 18th century examples, Mackinac, Apple Creek. The former, as I mentioned, was located within the middle ground as Richard White territorialized it. Now, White was specific about the particular conditions that brought the middle ground into existence in a particular place at a particular time. It was, he explained, the product of mutual weakness and fortuitous misunderstandings between French traders and officials and refugee Algonquin Indians in the western Great Lakes in the second half of the 17th and early first half of the 18th century. For White, the middle ground was at once a diplomatic, political, and economic alliance, and also a broader blurring of European and Indian ways, a fusion upon which a new composite culture came into being. As White's book detailed, the middle ground endured, if tenuously, through much of the 18th century and extended, if tentatively, around the Great Lakes and even into the Ohio Valley. White didn't extend the borders of the middle ground down the Missouri and Mississippi River, but here too I think we can find some of the factors were in place. At Apple Creek, as at Mackinac, economic ties, principally again trade and furs, and mutual weakness brought peoples together. For refugees from the Ohio Valley, both Indian and American, as well as more long-settled French colonists, all now under the nominal rule of Spain, the presence of an external threat, the Osage to the west, gave, as well as British rivals just across the Mississippi, turned the region into a quintessential borderland, a place where competing rivals could play, or Indians could play competing rivals off one another, giving them a better opportunity to take advantage of being in between. By playing European rivals off one another, Indians were often better able to fashion terms of trade and diplomacy that rested on delicately negotiated accommodations of a blending of Indian and European understandings. To be sure, violence was hardly absent from these places, from these border regions. If borderlands like Mackinac and Apple Creek bred accommodations, they also bled when trading turned into raiding, or when one or another party sensed the slightest tip in the balance of power. Very often, the violence that might have occurred between neighbors was instead displaced onto less powerful groups who were less well equipped to defend themselves. Still, the multipolar contests that characterized the interior of North America in the 18th century, that sustained conciliatory relations at Mackinac and Apple Creek and at scores of other places, do provide a stark contrast with what followed in the 19th century. Then, especially after the War of 1812, the United States and its western citizens operated in a more unchecked environment. Gone, for the most part, increasingly, were the fur-bearing animals upon which former relations had been built. Gone even more were the rough balances of power that contained unilateral exercises of that power, that constrained expansionist endeavors, that conditioned polities for compromise and invited people into cross-cultural borrowing. Gone was the concord that once characterized Mackinac and Apple Creek, and ejected too were most of the Indians and mixed Métis people who had been once part of these co-homelands. Along the Lewis and Clark Trail and overland trails, mostly amicable relations between Euro-Americans and Amerindians hung on into the middle of the 19th century. The conditions that enabled and then undermined these relations seem fairly easy to summarize. So long as Lewis and Clark and the Americans who followed them across overland trails and to the coast of Oregon or California were just passing through, or there principally to trade, conciliation held its ground. But once settlers moved in to stay, the balance of numbers changed, and so decisively did the character of these frontiers. Boyle Heights presents another variation on this theme of possibilities found and possibilities lost. Here in the second quarter of the 20th century was a neighborhood that boasted an ethnic variety which, if not uniquely Western, surely exemplified, I should say, the demographic diversity that was a hallmark of the region in general and of California in particular. Within this neighborhood, no group dominated. In that sense, a balance of power, or maybe a balance of powerlessness, prevailed. For at Boyle Heights, as in other places on my alternative history tour, mutual weakness once again supported a culture and a politics that encouraged the bridging of divides. But the sense of common culture and common struggle eroded after the middle of the 20th century. First, Japanese were removed from the neighborhood and relocated to internment camps. Then, especially after the war, the boundaries of whiteness opened up, and various people moved out of Boyle Heights, gaining access to privileges that were denied to non-white people. Their departure did not end the political alliances on which neighborhood that had grown out of the neighborhood, but it severed the social connections on which they had once been built. In the post-war decades, the demographic balance of the neighborhood changed decisively, and so did the character of this urban frontier. What then are the lessons that we can take away from this excursion into the history of the American West in the Twilight Zone? Actually, the lecture title aside, I don't think my history of Concord requires crossing over into another dimension. Not alternative realities. Mine, as I've tried to emphasize, is a history of alternative possibilities. It's true, our great advantage as historians is being able to discern what people did and the chain that followed from these actions. Because we know how things turned out, we, historians, tend to get things right when laying out our chains. Let's face it, knowing how things turned out is why historians tend to be much better at predicting the past than we are at forecasting the future. In fact, if we could do the latter, we'd be a lot more important than we are. But knowing how things turned out, which, as I said, is our great advantage as historians, knowing how things turned out is also our great disadvantage. It blinds us to the alternative possibilities that were in play in the past. Instead of multiple paths, we tend to focus on a single line, reinforcing the misimpression so prevalent among so many of us that the course of history is inevitable, that things move inexorably and unalterably to predictable outcomes. In this vision of how the past works, the history of American westward expansion was, to employ 19th century rhetoric, manifestly destined. A trip to the twilight zone of history, though, reminds us that it was not and it is not. So what finally is the legacy of Concord? The alternative history, this legacy of Concord, I readily concede should not hide the harsher truths of the legacy of conquest upon which the American West has been built. It's easy to find examples across the ages of expedient cross-cultural borrowings. That's not the same, though, as finding evidence of enduring cross-cultural understandings. Despite the allure of feel-good fantasies, we should be careful not to allow moments of uneasy amity to obscure eras of unrelenting enmity. But neither should we allow those eras of enmity to blind us to extended moments of amity. and to the possibilities at which those moments hint. The point is not to construct a history that allows us to feel better. It is to recover a history that allows us to better understand. To brought together, the legacy of Concord contradicts the pessimism of those who insist that the answer to the question, can we all just get along, has always been no. Instead, the question, did we ever all get along, merits the reply, albeit in a quiet, soft, uncertain voice, sometimes. And this alternative history, I hope, gives us hope for a future in which the answer to the question, can we all just get along, is maybe. Thank you. I'm happy to entertain questions or comments or whatever else comes to mind as we move from the Twilight Zone back to Provo, Utah.
Just really quickly, I'm interested how you got interested in the Boyle Heights to begin with. Like, what turned you on to that, and why did you select it as an example in the 20th century of Western history?
Right. I mean, it fascinated me because, as I said, I came across that that Federal Housing Authority report, which is a 1939 report, basically, which has that, that quote that just jumped out at me. And it's a quote that a number of historians have picked up on, this idea of a place being hopelessly heterogeneous. Because it seems to me, from our viewpoint, we would look at that as an example not of hopelessly heterogeneous, but we would take it as an example of hopefully heterogeneous. And I sort of began to ponder that and think about how our view about diversity has changed from that, and how this neighborhood gave us a sort of that view. At the same time, I have to confess, as I got deeper into it, I had a number of graduate students who've written dissertations that have looked at that neighborhood and looked at sort of the ethnic relations in that neighborhood, that I always was very suspicious of what my graduate students were coming back with in terms of their sort of what I thought was a little bit of this kumbaya version of Western history, in which everybody seemed to get along a little too easily. And I think I sort of began to sort of push them about the difference between using memoirs as a historical source and looking at other records, because I tend to think that memoirs tend to give us a rosier view of the past, that people tend to remember certain things in certain ways and sometimes to erase other things out of their memory. And yet at the same time, as I then started digging into some of that source material, I was struck by what I took to be an example of a place that was hopefully heterogeneous. And certainly it is a place that today is probably 99.5% Hispanic. It is certainly diverse in its own way in terms of just within the Spanish-speaking population, there's a remarkable heterogeneity, but it certainly seems not to compare to just the remarkable mix that had occurred 60 or 70 years ago. So I'm interested, there are a number of other urban neighborhoods in 20th century California that I know about that would have fit the bill as well, but this one was close to home, so that's how it got to it. But again, as I said, the larger question was just trying to ponder how it was that a federal official could write about this as hopelessly heterogeneous when the message I took away was quite the opposite.
Weren't the conflicts between the outlaws and the settlers, all of which were white, weren't they as great as the conflict with the Indians and the...
Well, I would say that this is not in any way to minimize the conflicts that accompanied sort of westward expansion in that way. I would say the body count was a lot lower, though, from those conflicts than from the Indian Wars over the centuries. That the number of the death rate, was considerably lower than what we would account for over the Indian Wars over several centuries. So in that sense, this is not in any way to minimize the seriousness of violence accompanying sort of the settlement of the West. But it is, I think, to sort of see it in the larger context. Though I'm interested, I mean, I don't, there's an interesting chapter to be written about places in the American West that we think of as being far more violent than they actually were. There's a book that came out a number of years ago called The Mild, Mild West, that looks at some of those places and looks at the ways in which we've exaggerated the degree to which violence, which we took to be commonplace, was not. Certainly there were, I mean, I think we can safely say, and there are historians in this room who know it far better than I do, that mining boom towns tended to be incredibly violent places. But lots of places in the American West in the late 19th century that we associate with high levels of interpersonal violence turn out not to be turn out not to be that way. And so that does, I think, raise something of a difference. In the back.
Within the scope of your research, do you differentiate between more institutionalized shifts in perception versus like socially initiated shifts?
What do you mean by that? That's an interesting question, but I'm not sure how. What are you getting at?
My closest example would be during the Civil War, kind of institutionalized historical, big H history perspective versus a more local social history.
Mm-hmm.
Do you differentiate between those two?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Because certainly, and this gets back to the question I raised earlier about Americans love their anniversaries, and then I said, but not all anniversaries, because one of the things that fascinated me in that regard is why certain anniversaries hit and others don't. From an institutional standpoint, for example, one would have expected that the big bicentennial of the last decade would have been the Louisiana Purchase. And yet, there was a lot of institutional attention devoted to the Louisiana Purchase bicentennial. And yet, in terms of the popular mind, you weren't going to sell a lot of books, and you were not going to draw much of a crowd talking about the 200th anniversary of the Louisiana Purchase. By contrast, the Lewis and Clark expedition clearly struck a sort of popular chord that went beyond simply what the official imprimatur would have been. And in that sense, it's not to sort of I guess the question is why the one and not the other, which I throw back on the audience. Why is it that, from a historian standpoint, I think most of us would agree that the Louisiana Purchase was the more significant historical episode than the Lewis and Clark expedition. And yet, as I said, judged by the popular attention to it, the popular commemoration, the one far outstripped the other.
Well, in possible answer to your question, the Lewis and Clark expedition had a more readily available, palatable political connotation.
Okay. Well, the Lewis and Clark expedition was a lot more fun. I think that's certainly part of it, that there's a certain eco-adventure to it. And I would argue there is what I called the sort of the feel-good version of it that is particularly appealing, I think, in this day and age to us. One of the things that I have looked at and written about is just the ways in which our commemoration of the Lewis and Clark expedition has shifted over time. That the way we celebrated the bicentennial bears little relationship to the ways in which the Lewis and Clark expedition was remembered 150 years ago or 100 years ago. That the Lewis and Clark expedition, it's one of the reasons, among many reasons, why The Far Horizon is such a dreadful, unwatchable movie. Well, it's a dreadful, unwatchable movie for a lot of reasons. But in part, it's a dreadful, unwatchable movie because it seems so far out of sync with the way in which, I hope there are no great fans of this movie in the room. I think I'm safe on this one. But that it's so out of sync with our own time and with our own sensibility or with our own memory of the Lewis and Clark expedition. So in that sense, I think just studying the changes over time in which how it's been commemorated is eye-opening in terms of seeing how our vision has changed and how the social vision has changed.
What marks the end of, this is kind of a two-part question.
Uh-oh.
What marks the end of what you call Western expansion? And if it has really continued until today, would you consider the civil rights movement, like everything that was part of the civil rights movement in this country, one of the longest standing conquests of Western expansion?
I would say, well, leaving aside the first part of the question, when does westward expansion end? If I were a true Turnerian, I could say 1890. No, I think we see it as ongoing, and that's why one of the things I'm interested in is tracing a history that sort of carries through to the present. In terms of the civil rights movement, absolutely, and in fact, one of the things, to get back to your question, that fascinates me about Boyle Heights is not simply what I see as these kind of social relations that develop, people dating across ethnic or religious lines, people marrying across ethnic or religious lines, people bearing offspring then and the children of these relationships. But the ways in which out of these social relations develops a particular political set of alliances that actually, in many cases, give birth to civil rights struggles. That I'm particularly interested in civil rights struggles that are born of sort of common habitation, people living together and sort of joining together because of that. That I think is quite different from civil rights struggles that emerge purely sort of more in isolation from one another. So in answer to your question, yes, I think the civil rights movement is in fact is an expression of the ways in which these conciliations are forged. Yeah.
So my question has more to do with historical methodology than with the subject material. I like how you justify your alternative history by saying the point is not to construct history to help us feel better, but rather to construct history to help us understand better. However, I think you probably agree often in various historiographies there's kind of a herd-like mentality among historians in that they want to justify this understanding history to feel better, and historians who do what you were trying to do kind of get trampled over in a way. They're met with a lot of hostility. Has that been your experience in your particular historiography, or would you say your experience has been one more of, I guess, a focus in Concord?
Right, well, that's okay. First, you rendered my quote much better than I did. I mangled it, so I have to remember how you said it, because I actually like the way you said it much better than the way it's not to make us feel good, but or not to help, how did you say it again? Because it was much better than the way I put it, and I got to use that.
As fast as I could.
Okay, but you got it better than I said it, so.
The point is reconstructing history that helps us feel, or to not reconstruct history that helps us feel better, but to help us.
Better understand. Thank you. That's the way I've got to do it in the future. I guess I don't know, because I'm giving this as a lecture. I haven't actually tried to publish it yet. And we'll see what kind of reception it gets. As I said, I think the purposes to which I'm putting it are out of sync with a lot of the ways in which the historiographic trends are moving. And yet, as I also said, and I thought I was quite open about this, that in putting this together, I'm drawing on a generation of scholarship. I've done some research on these places on my own. Some of the places I know better than others, but in other cases, I'm drawing on existing scholarship. I might be putting it to somewhat different purposes than the people who wrote those histories on which I'm drawing put it. But as I said, I think the work is out there. And again, I think I'm trying to walk a little bit of a tightrope here between, on the one hand, because I'm trying to be careful not to romanticize these moments that I'm talking about, these chapters, that I hope I've emphasized that oftentimes there were sort of powerful sort of geopolitical reasons why people had no choice but to get along. And that the moment they had an opportunity to sort of get away with not getting along, they often did. Or even more so, and I could have emphasized this point, when you look more closely at some of my examples, oftentimes what happened is Group A and Group B got together in order to push out Group C or to mess over Group C in some way. And so, again, this, I think, moves us away from what I call the kumbaya sort of version of the story. I'm really trying to be careful to try to sort of understand these places and times in ways that don't turn them into feel-good fantasies, but to try to recognize, well, are there any larger lessons here? And part of it is, as I say, I think where nobody can dominate Oftentimes that can lead to intense bloodshed, where people think, where nobody can dominate, so they fight one another to the death in order to sort of try to establish domination that nobody can. But in those places, sometimes, as I said, I found people sort of learn how to get along. And even though I would say that getting along is never as fully realized, never as enduring as we might like, it does provide us with an alternative blueprint, an alternative template that I think provides us with, to get back to the quote, that provides us with a more hopefully heterogeneous past to look at, which I hope gives us a more hopefully heterogeneous future to think about in that way. At least that's where I'm going. And I hope though, it's about finding a history that really is a usable past in that way. I mean, I think, look, working, part of my life I spend as a professor, and there I have a captive undergraduate audience that sort of has to listen, like many of you tonight, to what I have to say. But working at the museum and trying to sort of think about why should people care about Western history in Los Angeles, which is, after all, the primary people that we draw at the Autry Museum. Why should they care about the Western past? For them, Gene Autry is now a completely unfamiliar name. They don't know who he was. That legacy means nothing to them. And the legacy of Westerns, really, as I said, the John Wayne and Dances with Wolves means nothing to them. So in some ways, it's been a search to think about what makes Western history matter. Especially this might be different here. When I asked my students at UCLA, how many of them think of themselves as Westerners? Almost none of them raised their hands. Because they think of Westerner as a category that's sort of out there and back then. That you have to go east from Los Angeles to get west, in other words. And you have to go back in time to be Western. Now, obviously, from the point of view of a museum, that's not a recipe for drawing large numbers of people in if they don't see this history as meaningful to them. Now, I would argue that we're Westerners. If you live in the Western United States, you are a Westerner. And I would even argue a broader definition than that. But it's not one that resonates. And so in some senses, I suppose, and this goes back to your question too, this history is one that I've been thinking about because I've also been thinking about what public meaning does Western history have in the 21st century? What public claim does the Western past have on an audience, including those who no longer were raised on Westerns, so for whom that is no longer a familiar touchstone, and who no longer, in many cases, see the West as a category that's relevant to them, that's meaningful to them, that is one that that they draw an identity from. I hope the history that I described, though, or that I'm pursuing, is one that is meaningful to them, that is one that is both meaningful if you live in Los Angeles, or if you live in Provo, Utah, or if you live in any of the places between and beyond. Or so we'll see. Maybe it's going to be a very short book and a very small exhibition.
That you can't, like the significance of the conquest narrative is actually contingent on either the reality or at least the prospect of Concord, or the erasure of Concord.
Right.
The converse is also true. The Concord, it finds its meaning out of Concord.
I am so grateful that this lecture is being taped, because this is the second line that I now have to steal. Because that actually puts it, again, far better. I mean, that actually is exactly true. I mean, and that's actually something I need to grapple with much more. The ways in which these are they're not opposites in a sense. They're entwined. And actually that's a relationship that I need to think about much more. But I think you're absolutely right that they're mutually constitutive. That's the way you said it, right?
Yeah, and in fact, one of the images you were talking that came to mind, you mentioned Buffalo
Right.
And the crowds would have been aware of this, and that, you know, the Native American village that was a part of the encampment, et cetera. And they would have kind of held those two narratives.
Right, well, and even beyond that, the same audience that could look at John Gask's American Progress also was the same audience for Buffalo Bill Cody. And although I sort of posit it as there are these two differing traditions that we have, there are these two different kinds of stories that we have told about the American West. The one, the Buffalo Bill, Teddy Roosevelt, and now, more recently, the inverted version of the Buffalo Bill, Teddy Roosevelt, one that emphasizes the bloodshed and the violence, versus the more pacific passage across the continent, the Frederick Jackson Turner / John Gask version. And I've posited them as opposites in some ways, but I think the way you just suggested is they are actually flip sides of the same coin in some way, and that the one is always sort of the other side of the other. And that's actually a really interesting way to put it. I'm not sure, though, sort of where we go with that from. I mean, I think it's a really, really fascinating insight that I'm going to ponder, but I don't know where, I'm not sure that it changes anything that I argue, but it certainly changes the framework in which I put it forward in a really interesting way. Tom?
I have a prediction.
Uh-oh.
When you publish this, that some people will think you're taking on Patty Limerick and the New Western.
A little bit, yes.
They'll either intentionally
Mhm.
or perhaps out of ignorance misunderstand what you're saying, and maybe even classify you as a neo-Turnerian.
I have been called that, and not usually as a compliment.
No, and it wouldn't have been a compliment either in that context.
Right. But I, you know, as you heard, and I think the way you framed the question, no question, when you write something, once it's out there, it's beyond your control how people read it. I hope in the way that I've talked about it this evening, I've tried to say that's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying for something even beyond that. I'm not interested in fighting the battle between old and new Western histories in a sense. I'm looking for a new Western history that's a more useful Western history. And maybe that's going to get me in a lot of trouble with a lot of people, but going back to your question, that's trouble that I'd like to be in, actually. I think that's a good kind of trouble. That's trouble we need. As opposed to some of the trouble that we, at least in the academy, sort of pursue that is kind of meaningless in some ways. Let's erase that from the tape, by the way. As long as I can erase Pocahontas from my PowerPoint, we can take that line out. Thank you so much. This was very helpful to me.